Next week, we celebrate International Women's Day. On Double O Direct, every Saturday is International Women's Day.
As it should be.
What does that mean to you? What does that day symbolize?
So in some ways, I'm sort of cross that we have an International Women's Day, because it implies that men get the other 364 and a quarter, which you don't. We share them all. But I think the importance of days like this is to highlight some of the challenges that still face particular groups in this world or particular issues in this world. So International Forestry Day on the 21st of March, I'll be up in Homer Bay supporting forests, international forests. But I think the thing about International Women's Day is it's a day when we all need to take a breath and just think, where have we come from? And we've come an awful long way in terms of women's rights across the world, but we've still got a really long way to go. 1 in 3 women globally will suffer some sort of physical or sexual violence at the hand of a man, usually somebody she knows, in her lifetime. And that 1 in 3, that is not acceptable.
Speaking of suffering violence at the hands of a man, you have a gender-based violence experience that you encountered whilst working. Can you get into that?
So it's actually something I was too embarrassed to talk about for a few years. I was in Iraq. I was seconded to the Italian military, and I came in. We had sort of very flimsy accommodation, and I came in one night. I was in my little room getting ready for bed or something, and this guy walks in that I've just never seen before and proceeds to sexually assault me. And I'm kind of like, I have no idea what is like, how is this happening? In my case, I didn't know him. Obviously, in most cases, women do know their assailant. And to be honest, I still can't remember exactly what happened or what I said, but I managed to persuade him that he needed to leave after he kind of like shoved me up against the wall and sort of touched me and things like that. So I persuaded him that he needed to leave. And then the next day, told a friend who was based in Basra, a couple of 100 miles away, just in a kind of, I need to tell somebody because this still doesn't feel quite real, but I'm also a bit worried about my safety. And he absolutely blew his top. He's like, okay, I'm going to come and get you. I'm going to have to tell the general. I'm like, don't tell the general. He's like, I'm going to tell the general. Can I tell the general? Anyway, in the end, one of my British military colleagues sort of had words to make sure that this guy didn't come near me again. And then actually I went back to another bit of Iraq, back to the British military camp that I'd previously been based in. And what happened there that was so important for me and enabled me to digest it was that, one, people believed me. Nobody went, oh, did you lead him on? What were you wearing? I was wearing, it doesn't matter what I was wearing, but nobody asked me those questions. I was believed, and a network of men came in to support me. There were no women around, but these men came in to support me, and that was just incredibly powerful and enabled me to process it and deal with it. But it's still something you feel like slightly embarrassed about. Did I do something? Had I been had he seen me in some way? Had I had an interaction that I can't remember with him? Did I lead him on in some way? And these are the questions we women ask ourselves, and we shouldn't ask them, because no. This was all this guy's doing. I was not responsible for this. But that's why I didn't talk about it for many years, because I was embarrassed. And then I realised that it was wrong to be embarrassed. Actually, this was not my thing. This was his thing.
Research suggests that a lot of predators rely on the underreporting of incidents to keep perpetrating these acts. Here in Kenya, we saw an upsurge of gender-based violence during the lockdown in COVID. I know the UK supports a lot of girls' education programs, but we saw a lot of these girls experience incidents of abuse and assault when the school was closed, when schools were closed. With regards to underreporting vis-a-vis consequences, in relation to your own personal experience and in general, those two tend to go hand in hand. You mentioned strong words. However, were there any charges of assault? Were there any consequences that the man who assaulted you actually faced?
So years on, this is the bit I feel guilty about, right? Because I just dealt with the thing that I needed to do in that moment.
Yes.
And there was also quite a bit of tension between the British and Italian military. Yes. So there was actually a geopolitical consequence. And I knew that the British military would try and come down on this guy like a ton of bricks, but it would upset the bilateral relationship between Britain and Italy. And so I chose not to pursue any actions against this guy because of the wider geopolitics, which was a real thing. But with hindsight now, I feel guilty because I don't know if he went on to do that with other women. And could I have stopped that? So yeah, I do feel guilty about that.
That was not my intention at all to make you feel guilty, but just to understand some of the other challenges you've had in your career, especially as a result of you being a woman, because there's certain things like what you just explained that would not have happened if you were a man.
Yeah.
Are there any other incidences or experiences you've had in your career that you can attest to? This only happened because I'm a woman, including incidences of sexism.
Yeah, I think good and bad experiences of being female. Actually, I did some research on this a few years ago, particularly focused on Western diplomats who'd been posted to the Middle East, which is where I'd spent much of my career. Now, I caveat this with saying it was primarily white women because that's at the time what the diplomatic service was made of. We've got much better nowadays, and the overwhelming evidence was kind of, one, as a woman you get invited to more things. Actually, you have more opportunities because particularly in male dominated environments they want to mix it up and have some women there, so you get more invitations. You get there, you walk into the room and 20 points is dropped off your IQ because you're female. And a black female diplomat said to me, yep, and try being black and you can knock off another 20. These guys then talk to you and you have a good conversation and they actually open up to you in a way they probably wouldn't with a male colleague or someone they saw as more of an equal. And then you kind of get on well and they tell you things they probably shouldn't. And then they kind of panic slightly. I found this a lot, including in Iran, actually. And then they sort of panic slightly because they're like, oh my God, I overshared with a British diplomat. But of course, you're a professional. You're not going to burn them. You're not going to use the information against them. You're a professional. And so then they realise that you're safe and you can actually ultimately end up with better relationships, I think, in a male-dominated world if you're female. But there's a lot of bad stuff that you have to go through first. And, the number of meetings that I've been in where, and I know this isn't exclusively a male-female thing, where I've been talked over by men. Actually, it happened only the other week. I was at a very, very nice dinner and there was one man and three of us and we were talking about something geopolitical.
Yes.
Because, that's how I mix up my Sunday nights because I'm so much fun.
That's how you do it, I see. Right?
Yeah, if you ask me what I do for fun, that probably is one of the things I do. And then because there was another guy and he was outside the conversation because of my inclusive leadership we were talking about, I included this other guy in the conversation. And then suddenly it ended up as the two guys talking with a much higher volume than the women were doing. And we couldn't physically get a word in edgeways. And I thought, hold on, this is every meeting that I've been in.
Yes.
And so, previously I might have interrupted the men, but instead I'm like, nah, do you know what? The three women were having a very good conversation about geopolitics. We'll just continue our conversation. They can have their boys chat. Afterwards, we can compare notes.
That is absolutely brilliant. So what do you do for fun now that you brought it up?
What do I do for fun? I do like talking about geopolitics. What do I do? I read quite a lot, although not as much as I would like. I do, watch absolute nonsense on television. That's my switch off point.
Love Island.
Do you know, I don't do reality TV. I end up going for like sort of sci-fi apocalyptic type of dramas.
Okay.
I don't know why, but that's what I end up watching.
What are you reading? I see a book there.
So I'm currently reading a book called Following Nellie Bly by Rosemary Brown. So back in 1872, a guy called Jules Verne wrote a book about circumnavigating the world in 80 days.
Yes, around the world.
Yeah, around the world in 80 days. And of course, at the time, rail travel had only just been invented. Aeroplanes had not. Lots of it was on steamships and things like that. And so he wrote this book in 1872. I only found out last week that the first person to actually do it was a 25-year-old American woman called Nellie Bly.
Oh my, I had no idea. And how did she do it?
She pretty much followed the Jules Verne book, actually, in terms of the travel that she went on. And she set out from New York, whereas Jules Verne's character had set out from London, but pretty much the same route, rail, train. She actually does a brief diversion to go and meet Jules Verne. And then halfway around the world, I think she's in Sri Lanka, she discovers that somebody else is doing the same thing.
Yes.
And it's a woman. So the first two people to cross the world in less than 80 days, fewer than 80 days, were both women.
So she did do it in less than 80 days.
She did. I haven't got to the end, but I think it's 76 days or something she does it in. The other woman, no, she does it in 72 and the other woman does it in 76.
Love it. Speaking of around the world, you've already talked about where you've been posted, but I'd like to understand some of the interesting places that you've been that maybe were not necessarily work-related.
Ooh, well, I'm actually just back from Sudan, and I was sort of messaging, various friends, currently in Sudan, here's a photo. And they were like, oh, are you with the Pope? And I thought this was great because, one, they think I'm the sort of person who would hang out with the Pope, which is great. I mean, to be fair, I do know the Archbishop of Canterbury, but not the Pope.
All right.
Secondly, he was in South Sudan and I was in Sudan.
Okay, Khartoum?
So I went to Khartoum, but I went to go and see the pyramids. So Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt. There are no other tourists there. And it's myself, my friend and a guide in these 2,000-year-old Egyptian tombs with Meroitic and Egyptian hieroglyphics. It was amazing. So that is my definition of fun.
Interesting. I love it. More with Her Excellency Jane Marriott, the British High Commissioner to Kenya, in a bit. This is 00 Direct.
I said